Afternoon, folks. Today I am coming to you from the grounds of a place called Montacute House, which is literally about a 20-minute walk down the road from me. And it's June. It's kind of a bit of an overcast day, but it's not too bad. And it's been a while since I last got to chat in my walk and talk series that I'm doing. I'm actually kind of going to do a continuation of what we did in the last episode of vibe coding. So today I'm going to talk you through how I've been doing some work vibe coding an API that, API protection, API Auth. And I'm going to do that as a continuation from the authentication vibe coding I did in my previous episode in my walk and talk series. Just to say, it's been a busy June so far. Yesterday, I think it was yesterday, was the longest day of the year. And yeah, there's been a lot going on this month, including visiting some meetup events and doing a few other things, mostly some work, or a lot of work on my B2B SaaS app that I'm creating. But it was actually because of that I thought I'd stop and share with you another video in my vibe coding exploits with customer identity and access management. Up there you can see Montacute House. You get a better view from it over here. And yeah, so I thought, well, let's go a bit local today. And I'm going to be talking today about authorization. So in the last vibe coding episode we talked about authentication, and I'm using Keycloak as part of my, a DIY, deploy it yourself, CIAM integration. And we did an authentication sequence. We got an ID token, we gave it to our application, and our application authenticated us. Today, I want to be calling an API. And so to call an API, I'm going to be using what's typically referred to as authorization. Now, I'm going to be leveraging OAuth 2, getting an access token, and today I'm going to be focusing on delegated authorization or consent, and then kind of using it in the context of my API and my application as well, obviously. So I'm going to be doing most of this using AI. GPT-4.1, as you probably recall from my previous episode, is the model that I'm using as part of Copilot, GitHub Copilot, and I'll be continuing to use that. It's a free tier experience, shall we put it like that, and enables me to play around with this sort of stuff without costing me any money. It's not specifically tuned for code generation, so it has some challenges, but as you'll see as we go through kind of what we built, what I built, then you'll see how I can nudge the AI into the direction I need it to go. It's not always the easiest thing to do, but it does work. Let's put it that way. So the first thing I've asked the AI to do is build me an API, and I'm going to be building two APIs. I'm only going to be implementing one of them, but I'm building them because they're based on a real-world implementation that I am developing for the B2B SaaS application I'm building. And it's going to be a scheduling API, or I should say really a schedule creation API, or schedule management API, and then a API for managing scheduled events. I'm really going to be, I'm going to get the AI to create both of them, create both of those API routes. And you can see it kind of in progress here with the schedule API. And I will show you the implementation from a schedule API perspective, and I'll leave you to kind of play at your own leisure with what you learn for the scheduled event API or the scheduled events API as well. Just coming round this wall here, that is Montacute House. It's a stately home. I'll just kind of come up against it a bit here. There you go, you can see that a bit better now. And Montacute House might look familiar because it's been in quite a few films and BBC productions over the years. And it literally is about, as I say, oh, let's get that back into focus. It's literally, as I say, about a 20-minute walk from where I live down in the rural southwest of England. So, as you can see, I prompted the AI to generate me an API. I gave it a prompt. I was fairly descriptive with my prompt. I left a few things out, as we'll go on to see. But, yeah, it's done a pretty reasonable job, I think. Now, I came across an article recently, and I've kind of got a blog post that is a companion to this this video, as always, and you can read more about that in the blog post. But the article I came across was by 1 Blue 3 Brown, or 3 Blue 1 Brown, something like that, and it's all about how large language models and generative progressive transformers, or generative pre-trained transformers, variations on the GPT acronym, actually work from the perspective of what they do. And it's really interesting. It's really kind of insightful as to how it builds the kind of stuff it builds, and effectively how context and the specifics of language are very important when you're actually prompting. So for those of you who watched my last episode, you'll know that we always come up with a few errors on the first pass. Interestingly, like asking it to create a separate interface or a separate route for the event side of the schedule kind of illustrates the use of language and how you have to be specific with the language you use in your prompts. And it ended up thinking that I was talking about a TypeScript interface, and it fixed the errors that I had, but I go back, you'll see how I had to go back and reprompt it to create the second API, or the second API route that I wanted to code as part of the schedule, and that's for scheduled events. And it really does show how you have to be specific with language. Now, if you're following along with this series on AI and vibe coding, etc., what I've also done is put together a GitHub repo, and I'll share the link down here. And in the GitHub repo, you'll find all of the code kind of as I build it through the episodes, and you'll also be able to go through the exercises and effectively see how at the end of the blog post, I always give you some challenges, follow-up challenges, and you'll see how I tackled those and see how yours compares. Yours might be better. I'm not saying that it will be any worse. It will certainly probably be different, but well, you can see. And hopefully they'll give you an opportunity to leverage the code as we go without having to do too much of the actual vibe coding process yourself. But that's part of the challenge, yeah? That's part of the fun. Look, here's the original entranceway. It would have been the original entranceway to Montacute House. The entrance is now in a different location, but back in the day, this would have been kind of, I suppose, indicative of most stately homes in Britain. And what you saw from your house was that as your driveway, essentially. And there's some cows in the background there. You probably can't see them from here, but there's some cows in the background there grazing now. But that's what you would have seen back in the day. And if you lived there, you'd have seen people coming up in horse and carriage up your drive, effectively, to come visit you, or bring people to a party that you're having, or whatever. So yeah, it's kind of living maybe different times these days, but there we go. Yeah, so we've vibe coded the API and we've vibe coded the routes, and I didn't expressly ask the AI to add security to it, and that's illustrative of the fact that the language I used didn't kind of lend to adding in security by default. So the next step is to essentially add in the access token mechanism for protecting these API routes. Okay, so we've asked AI, Copilot, to go and get us an access token, and it's kind of done what most things normally do, and you can read a little bit more about that in the blog post that accompanies this. And now we're going to ask Copilot to implement code to check the access token, make sure it's valid. There are a number of different checks you want to do on an access token to make sure it's valid, and validate the access token, and then essentially look at the claims within the access token to verify that the request can be performed. Now remember, this is all validating essentially that an authenticated user has made a request to perform an operation via an API, but we're not at any point in time doing any access control checking. So we're not validating that the user is able to perform these operations. That we'll cover in a future video. For now, we've got an API call implemented, or we've got an API implemented, I should say. We've got the access token, an access token available to us, and now let's go and get the AI to put together a UI so that we can actually see this in action. Now I'm using, I suppose, a general purpose GPT, and it's not really tuned to building code, for example, but specifically not tuned to building a UI. So here's the prompt I used to actually build the UI, and actually it didn't do a bad job. It's a fairly basic prompt. Again, it's one of those things where, going back to what I was saying previously, context, the language that you use are all very important, but it's a fairly basic prompt, and I can't really complain with the UI that it's come up with based on the prompt that I gave it. Now, my view on using AI for this kind of work is to do it small and do it progressively. This is where, if I just use some general prompt to try and get AI to build an entire application for me, it will go horribly wrong. So this is a really good illustrative, or a really good illustration of that point. That do specific things with a specific context, a specific outcome, and build on them. Don't try and do everything at once. Don't try and assume that the AI is going to do everything for you, because chances are it probably won't. You may have noticed in Visual Studio Code, which is typically my editor of choice, that I've got up in the top left-hand corner some what look like kind of controls from a 1990s VCR. Play, stop, fast forward, rewind, whatever. Whenever I'm doing stuff like this, I really like to use the interactive debugging facilities within Visual Studio. They're really good for pretty much every application, but for Next.js applications, they're really simple to set up. And you can do both server-side and client-side debugging. Interactive debugging is really one of those things that I think is very much misunderstood. I don't think it's misunderstood. I think it's just underused. It can really help to help you understand what's going on, fixing issues, getting to the bottom of problems, etc. So my kind of top tip, as an aside for vibe coding, is to utilize interactive debugging if you're comfortable doing so. Anyway, so I've got my UI. I'm not using AI model that's specifically tuned to building a UI, so it's the UI is nothing special. I can build on that later, but I'm getting the list of schedules, and now I've got an option to create a schedule, and you see I've got a create button there. I can fill some details in, I can create a schedule. So I've changed the way that create works. Create's one of those arguably security sensitive operations, and it's like moving the amount of money. I'm going to create something new, update something existing. They're all one of those arguably security sensitive kind of operations. So we've changed from using an access token client side to using an access token server side to actually stop the access token from coming into a public client or a public kind of domain setting. And that protects the access token. So I'm effectively doing a form post in the create, and then leveraging an access token to call the API at the back end. One of the things I talk about in my corresponding article is how I've built an API that is essentially part and parcel of the application. Now, it's really straightforward to do that with something like Next.js, because Next.js is a server-side or traditional web application, let's put it that way. So it's it's definitely something you can do, and there are lots of benefits for doing it, especially when you're prototyping and kind of researching things. It's very valuable to do that. So the API is part and parcel of the same application. So when I execute the application, everything is kind of there, present and ready to go from an API perspective. Okay, so we've built the API. We've modified the application to call the API, done some client-side renderings and done some server-side rendering. So yeah, well, let's put it all together and see how it looks from an end-to-end perspective. And you can see exactly what happens as we execute it. So I wanted to close out on this particular episode with a couple of reflections, let's put it that way. Firstly, I want to talk a little bit about maintenance or maintainability of code. You'll notice, and I certainly have noticed, but you can read more about it in, as I say, the blog post that accompanies this video, that there's quite a lot of duplication that seems to have cropped up from the perspective of using AI. And I put a lot of that down to the fact that you kind of lose context. You end up maybe starting and stopping the chat. You maybe have a break in the continuity of working with the AI, and all of these things are perfectly natural. So sometimes what the AI does is essentially generates a solution, but it hasn't taken into consideration something it might have already generated before. And I'm sure that might improve with different tuned models. So there's an element of refactoring, I think, that you need to do. You need to take points where you just take a pause and maybe go back and refactor code as opposed to just keep on generating code. Because otherwise you're just going to kind of get a lot of technical debt that you're going to have to come back and service at some point. And as AI builds on that, you're going to compound that technical debt. So stopping and kind of doing a little bit of refactoring is a good thing. And that's what I've done, is I've kind of, before I submit this, the code that got generated to the GitHub repo that I'm put or stood up, that follows this vibe coding series. So that's one thing. And the second thing is really to reiterate that what you ask for, the way you ask for it, and how much context you provide is really important. Have a look at that video if you get the chance that I talked about from 3 brown, 1 blue, or 1 brown. I really can't remember the name of it, but I put a link to it, and you'll see how the way that the language models work really kind of shows why AI does some of the things that it does. And you'll then get to appreciate more, I think, why what you say, how you say it, the language you use, and the context you provide are really important. So that's it for this episode. Montacute House in the background. I'm going to wave bye-bye. And I guess that's all that's left for me to say is happy vibe coding and integrating with CIAM 2. I will catch you in the next episode. Ciao for now. Take care.